Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, I'm going to be talking about the IELTS writing. Last couple of days, we talked about the task one. Today, we're going to talk about task two, and there's actually two different lectures about task two. Okay, so this is the first one, and we'll get into the second one the next time. So, again, for our course plan, task one is academic writing. We already talked about that. And task two is writing. And we're going to be focusing on task two today, which is the writing task. So, this lesson today is going to cover the different types of essays and what the structure of a good essay looks like. Also, how to identify each essay by type. We're also going to talk about what steps are necessary to be successful with the writing task in general, and also how to write a good introduction. Now, next day's lesson, we're going to focus on how to write good body paragraphs and good conclusion. Today, we're just going to do good introduction and also talk about some background about this as well that's going to be useful. So, let's first talk about what makes a good essay. What are they looking for on this test? Well, they're looking for good structure. So, they want an introduction, a body, and a conclusion for this essay. They also want a strong argument that's backed up with proof and examples as well that connect back to our thesis, right? Back to our original point that we're trying to prove here. Also, strong vocabulary that relates to the overall topic. So we'll get into that depending on what the topic is. And we'll go over, I think there's three examples I'm going to go over today, three different topics, three different introductions. And then also well structured paragraphs with good transitions as well. So we don't want the paragraphs to kind of jump all over the place. We want the paragraphs to make good sense and the writing to make good sense to someone who is reading it. Okay, so those are the main things that make a good essay in terms of getting to the level that we need to get a good score on writing task two. So let's also talk about what are the specific IELTS essay requirements, right? What is this specific test looking for? Because previously we just talked about in general what makes a good essay, but I also want to discuss what exactly are the people marking your essay looking for. So you'll be given 60 minutes to complete task one and task two. So that's about 30 minutes for each task. However, for a lot of people, it takes less time to write task one than task two. So maybe you finish task one and you only took 20 minutes or 25 minutes. So you have 35 to 40 minutes for task two. And that's perfectly fine as well, as long as you've done task one to the best of your ability. That's totally fine. But you get 60 minutes to do both tasks, not 60 minutes for each task, 60 minutes total. So you should also write at least 250 words for your essay, and it should include an introduction, body, and conclusion. Very, very important. Okay, they actually dock you if you do not write at least 250 words. Okay. For more information about specifically how they're marking it, you can go to the IELTS website, and I think we do discuss that more actually next day. There's a slide about that. But long story short, the main things you're looking for are good, strong arguments backed up with examples and explanations. Also, good spelling and grammar. They're also looking for good vocabulary, and they're also looking for good, coherent writing. So, does the writing make good sense? Or is the writing kind of all over the place, very choppy, right? So those are the four main things kind of summarized. I will go into more detail in that in the next one. In this course specifically, we're going to make sure we go over three out of those four things. The only thing I won't talk about as much in this specific course is grammar, because grammar is a whole different topic that we do need to implement to get a high score here, but it's not specifically related to the actual writing. In this for this writing program, we're going to be focusing on the other three things, which are the structure of the writing. Also, are we making good, strong points, right? Good, strong points with evidence, with examples to back it up. And also, are we using good vocabulary? Those are the main three things I'm going to focus on in this course specifically. However, I will also include good proper grammar as well. I'm just not going to go into grave detail about discussing grammar and why is this period here and why is this comma there and things like that. I'm not going to specifically go into tons of detail about. Everything else I will go into detail about, and I will still talk about grammar here too. That's just not the main focus of this course. The main focus of this course is essay requirements for IELTS and getting the content and structure and vocabulary in place for this specifically. Okay. Whereas grammar is a universal thing, right? Whether we're writing this essay or whether we're writing something else, it doesn't matter. Grammar is going to be the same, pretty much anyway. All right, so there's some different types of essays they might ask you to write. They will not ask you to write all of these. They will just have you write one essay. So they might ask you to write an opinion essay, a discussion essay, a problem and solution essay, a cause and effect essay, an advantages and disadvantages essay, or a double question essay. Okay? So in general, our essay structure needs to look like this. We need to have an introduction, we need to have paragraph 1, paragraph 2, and conclusion. Okay, and I will be going into more detail about for each type of essay, what will you put for paragraph 1, paragraph 2, introduction, conclusion, all of that. And I'll also be going over in the future, well, what are the different parts of the introduction? What are the parts of the body paragraphs and what are the parts of the conclusion? Today specifically, I'll just be going over parts of the introduction, but in our next lecture, we'll be going over what are the parts of paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 more specifically in more detail. So that detail will be given later. This is just, very bare bones. What do we need for our essay? We need an introduction, 2 body paragraphs, and a conclusion, and that's it. Okay, so for an opinion essay or a discussion essay, in the introduction, you're going to give your opinion. The paragraphs will discuss your reasons for your opinion. So, paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 will give the reasons for your opinion. And of course, it'll be more detailed than that, right? But, long story short, to put it in the quickest terms, introduction to give your opinion, paragraph 1 and 2 are to give your reasons for that opinion and to, of course, back them up with evidence and examples, which we'll get more into later. For advantages and disadvantages essay, you're going to give an introduction. Paragraph 1 is going to talk about an advantage or the advantages, and paragraph 2 will talk about a disadvantage or the disadvantages. For a problem and solution essay, you're going to start with your introduction, and then paragraph 1 will talk about the problem and solution one. And then paragraph 2 will talk about a second problem and second solution to the problem. And then you'll have your conclusion as well. For the double question essay, you're going to have your introduction. Paragraph 1 will be about answering and explaining your reasons as to why that's your answer for the first question. Paragraph 2 will have you answering and explaining your answer for the second question, and then conclusion. So all of these are very similar, right? All of these are very, very similar. It's just that sometimes paragraph 1 and 2 are slightly different depending what type of an essay it is. But overall, it's introduction, paragraph 1, 2, conclusion, and bam, we're done. So we're going to talk today about introduction specifically. So how do we write a good introduction? What's the structure for introduction specifically? So an introduction needs to have these 4 things. We first need to paraphrase the question, okay? Because we're going to assume that the reader doesn't know what the question is. The reader, even though technically the reader can see the question, we're going to assume the reader can't see the question. So we need to explain what our essay is about and paraphrase the question or query that we are being asked about. Number 2 is to briefly state your opinion. And the reason I say briefly here for the introduction is because in the introduction phase, we're not actually going to go into examples and explanations. We're going to save that for the body paragraph. So for 2, we just briefly state, here is my opinion. We don't have to go into details as to why that's our opinion, but we do later, just not yet. Number 3 is to introduce reasons briefly, right? So again, we don't need to go into full detail. We can save that for the main body paragraphs, but we do want to briefly introduce what are the reasons we're going to argue for why that's our opinion. And then last but not least, we need to write a thesis statement stating what this essay will examine. And we're going to connect back to this thesis statement throughout throughout our body paragraphs. And we're going to restate our thesis in our conclusion. So there we go. There we have it. Okay, so I'm going to give 3 different examples of questions we could be asked. We're going to talk about what type of essay it is and also a sample answer. So The first question asks, is it good for young adults age 18 to 25 to continue living with their parents without paying rent? Discuss the advantages and disadvantages. Okay, so this one clearly is an advantage and disadvantage essay. And so going back to the structure for that, that means we need to do an introduction. We need to write a paragraph with advantages and a paragraph with disadvantages and a conclusion. So that means in our introduction, when we're introducing our ideas, we need to introduce at least one advantage, at least one disadvantage. Okay. Now, in general, sometimes when we're writing an essay, we can just take one side. And in general, that is what we tend to do. However, because this one is an advantage disadvantage one, it's important to, even if you feel very strongly that young adults should stay with their parents and that there's a lot more advantages than not, or the opposite, that there's a lot more disadvantages than not, even if you feel that way, do put in at least one advantage, at least one disadvantage for this type of essay. Very important. Doesn't matter if you actually agree with that point of view, that perspective, but do definitely put one in and argue that side as well, because after all, this is an advantages and disadvantages essay. If you just write one, well, or you argue one side for this kind of essay specifically, then that's not good. That's not meeting their requirements. Okay, so let's review. What were the requirements? The first one is in purple and it's paraphrase the question. So that basically means to state the question in our own words, right? So in recent years, more and more young adults are living with their parents as opposed to moving out and finding their own place, right? That's generally what this is going to be about. We're kind of paraphrasing the question. We're talking about how young adults are more likely to do that than they used to be, right? And then the pink part is where we're going to briefly state our opinion. So there are advantages and disadvantages to this phenomenon, right? Then in the blue, we're going to introduce our reasons. So, what's one advantage and one disadvantage? We don't have to go into full details about them because, again, we can save that for the body paragraphs, but we do need to put in one advantage and one disadvantage. We need to state them. So the advantage I decided to state was that, yeah, basically that young adults can pursue higher education more easily without going into as much debt or any debt in some cases by staying at home and not paying rent. But the disadvantage I stated was that it can prevent some young adults from learning adult responsibilities, right? Now, notice I don't go into a lot of detail there. I don't really explain at this point, well, how come adults living at home leads to them being able to pursue higher education with less debt. Now, maybe you already have an idea of why that might be. You can probably, think of that idea yourself, and that's great. That's really great. But I didn't put that here. Or same with, adults learning adult responsibilities. I didn't really go into detail here and explain, well, how does that actually connect with, living on your own versus living with your parents. I didn't make that connection just yet because we're not there yet. I am going to make that connection in the body paragraphs later, which we'll see in the next lecture. But for now, I'm just briefly stating those things. So I want to stress that in our introduction, you just have to state them. You don't have to go into details. Then we're going to write a thesis statement stating what this essay will examine. So, what is the main point that we're trying to make with this essay that we're going to continue to come back to? So, let's read that. It says, I think that it's a good thing for young adults to continue living with their parents if they're pursuing higher education or saving up money during their stay, but that it is a bad thing for young adults who are not doing anything productive while living at home. So there we go. So there's our thesis. Our thesis basically is that it's good if they're being productive while living at home and pursuing higher education, having adult responsibilities. But if we're not doing anything productive, then it's not good, right? So that's the main thesis. And so since that's the thesis, that's what we're going to have to connect back to later on in our essay. Okay, but there we go. There's an example. Let's move on to another example. This one says some politicians believe that nonviolent criminals should be made to do community service work instead of going to jail. To what extent do you agree or disagree? So, in this case, this is an opinion essay, right? They ask us to what extent do we agree or disagree. So, we could just maybe somewhat agree or somewhat disagree, or maybe we strongly agree or we strongly disagree, and any of those is fine. We can have a very strong opinion or maybe a less strong opinion with some advantages and some disadvantages. Doesn't matter because it's about our opinion. Now, you don't actually have to write your true opinion. You can write whichever opinion you think is going to be easiest to state. Oftentimes, I find that that is my own opinion. I know my own opinion better than I maybe understand the argument of the converse, right? And I think a lot of people feel that way as well. However, if you do understand the converse argument really well, and that would be easier for you to argue, absolutely go for it too, right? Because they're not actually grading you based on, oh, did this person have this opinion that's the same as me or not? They don't care about that. They care about, did you make good arguments and did you follow the structure properly? That's what we care about. So let's start with the first one, which is the purple. It's paraphrase the question, right? So the question itself was that some politicians believe that nonviolent criminals should be made to do community service work instead of going to jail. And I paraphrase that as in recent years, there have been more discussions about the criminal justice system and whether nonviolent criminals should go to jail or be given community service. All right, so there we go. So I did word it differently, but I essentially said kind of the same thing as above. Okay. Then the pink is briefly state your opinion. So I'm not going to go into much detail as to why I believe what I believe on this, but I'm going to briefly state my opinion. So I wrote here, I strongly believe that nonviolent criminals should be given community service rather than jail time. So there we go. My opinion, all done. That said, you could put any opinion you want. So maybe you strongly disagree. Maybe you strongly believe that nonviolent criminals should absolutely be given jail time, that they shouldn't be given a less harsh punishment just because they're nonviolent, and that whether someone's violent or nonviolent, a crime is a crime, right? That could be someone's perspective as well, and that's totally fine too. All right, and let's move on to blue. So we need to introduce our reasons without going into full detail about our reasons. So my reasons, it says this is because community service has a positive impact on our community, whereas it is costly to put more people in jail. Also, since these criminals are not violent, there is not much risk to society of keeping them out of jail. So those are my two reasons. Number one, community service positively impacts society. Two, keeping them out of jail isn't risky to society, right? Whereas keeping, uh, maybe I think that the jail spaces need to be kept for people who are violent, right? Who will cause harm, physical harm to others and property and things like that, if they are kept out of jail and just given community service. So then number 4 is my thesis statement, and that's going to talk about what my essay will examine overall. And so here it says, overall, it is better for society to sentence nonviolent criminals to community service hours rather than jail time, right? So that's what I'm going to argue throughout this essay. Now, that said, you could be given this prompt and your thesis could be something totally different. Your reasons could be totally different. Your opinion could be totally different. Your thesis could be that it's that you think it's better for nonviolent criminals to also be given jail time as opposed to community service, right? Perhaps you're concerned that they won't take the community service seriously, or they're not very trustworthy workers because they already have committed crimes. So who knows if they're actually going to take their work seriously, all that kind of stuff, right? So there could be lots of reasons why someone might disagree with this perspective and might take the other perspective too, right? The point is, the point isn't, does your answer exactly line up with mine? It's more, but what I do want you to ask yourself is, does your answer clearly have these 4 steps in this order this way? And if it does, good, you're on the right track. And if it does not, then that's a problem, right? But the actual opinions you voice here could be completely different from mine and still correct for the purposes of the IELTS. Okay, so yeah. So that's the main point here. Let's do a third example. This one says, most people in today's society are not very conscious of their health. So that's a statement that someone's making, that's someone's opinion. What is your opinion about this statement? So maybe you agree with the statement, maybe you disagree with the statement. So what's my first thing? My first thing is to paraphrase the question, right? So in purple, I'm paraphrasing my question by saying, many people feel that most people in today's society are not very conscious of their health. And then pink is briefly state your opinion. So I include in the same sentence, and I agree with this opinion. Then the blue is briefly stating my reasons for agreeing with this opinion. And I say this is because fast food restaurants like McDonald's are continuing to be successful, and because many people smoke even though we're aware of the health risks. So there we go. Two reasons. Number one, McDonald's is successful, and perhaps I don't think it would be a successful business if people weren't eating McDonald's. And we're aware that McDonald's isn't healthy. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when Super Size Me was out, one big question they had there, and this is an aside, by the way, this isn't much to do with this. Um, One big question was, how aware are people really of the health risks, right? But today people are more aware of the health risks. And same with smoking. People didn't used to be aware of the health risks of smoking. Today we're very well aware of the health risks, and yet there's people who still choose to do it, right? And so that suggests that in general, people are not very conscious of their health. And so the orange one is to write a thesis statement. My thesis for this one is that in general, many people aren't really very conscious of their health, right? Because they do these things. Not everyone, but enough people that the tobacco companies and the smoking companies and fast food companies are certainly in good business, right? Awesome. So there we go. So there's a third one. So, the main purpose of today, the main thing I want to make sure everyone understands is to, when you do your introduction, make sure that you include all of these things, but especially a thesis statement, because if there isn't a thesis statement or it's not clear to the examiner what your thesis is, what it is you're arguing, then that's going to make the body paragraphs that much harder, right? A conclusion is pretty short in comparison to the body paragraphs, but the sorry, I might have said the conclusion. I meant the introduction. It's very, very short in comparison to the body paragraphs. Body paragraphs are generally much longer, sometimes twice as long. But the introduction, completing your introduction properly, is going to help set you up for good body paragraphs. And that's all three of those together is going to help set you up for a good conclusion. In fact, probably if you've written everything else, the conclusion's the easiest to make because the conclusion doesn't actually introduce new things, right? With the introduction, you're starting your essay, right? You're starting talking about new things by paraphrasing, by stating your opinion, introducing reasons, which is what you're going to talk about in your main body paragraphs, and making up your thesis. And so sometimes an introduction can take a little bit longer per word, right, or per sentence than other parts of the essay. That said, do definitely leave a lot of time for the other parts of the essay. Don't spend half the time that you have to write this essay on just the introduction. That's not a good use of your time either. But also, don't freak out if it takes you 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, I would say, to write a good introduction. Generally, it is worth it to spend that extra time to get the introduction right to make sure everything else is correct, without going over 10 minutes. I still would not advise going over 10 minutes. But yeah, that's all I have to say about that. But anyways, good work today, everyone. Next day, we'll talk about writing body paragraphs and conclusions as well, and we'll go over the marking scheme of this in more detail. So good work today, and I will see everyone then. Bye, everyone.